52 years ago this week, Jonathan Myrick Daniels was martyred. Jonathan Myrick Daniels was a white man, an Episcopal seminarian, who answered the call of Dr. King to go south to Selma in 1965. In August of that month, Daniels found himself in Hayneville, Alabama, and he and 4 companions who were black were released from jail, and they were walking down the streets where Daniels and 16-year-old Ruby Sales and their companions were met by a white supremacist with a shotgun. He pointed the gun at Ruby Sales, and Jonathan Myrick Daniels stepped between Ruby and the barrel of that gun and was killed. "52 years later, we haven't learned a whole heck of a lot. White supremacy existed in 1965. It exists in 2017 as evidenced by a mass of white supremacists gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia this weekend to protest the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. There is no nuance with white supremacy. There is no argument to be made in its defense. There's no equal time that is due. White supremacy is evil. Let's take a few minutes and look at today's gospel and see what it might have to say about the United States of America in the year 2017. The apostles were in the boats. They were sailing across the sea. The wind was against them. Jesus was not in their boat. And Jesus, seeing their trouble, walks on the sea, walks on the surface of the water. And the disciples in the boat thought that it was a ghost, an apparition, a specter. And Jesus called out, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Simon Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, bid me to come out onto the water with you." And Jesus says, "Come." And Peter steps out of the boat onto the surface of the water until Peter begins to realize the turbulence of the surface on which he stands. And he takes his eye off Jesus, and he loses heart, and he begins to sink. And Jesus reaches out his hand and pulls Peter up out of the water. And the two of them get into the boat, and the seas calm. And Jesus and the disciples make their way safely to the other side. The white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia, and wherever they are sailing against the wind. And they are terrified because their ideology is bankrupt, and they are gasping for air. And Jesus most assuredly is not in their boat. In fact, I would argue that the Jesus many of them claim to worship is but a ghost, a figment, a wisp. The Jesus of white supremacy is an imaginary figure who is as pale and as hollow as the people who claim to worship him. Because that Jesus is not real, that Jesus cannot save them, that Jesus cannot pull them out of the water, that Jesus cannot get into their boat, because that Jesus does not exist. The Jesus who wants to reach out his hand to the white supremacists gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia, I would argue, as Dr. James Cone did about the same time that Jonathan Myrick Daniels was martyred. Dr. James Cone argued that Jesus is black. Not from sub-Saharan Africa, but black in as much as the Jesus of the Gospels was imprisoned and shackled in the belly of slave ships making their way across the Middle Passage. Jesus felt the lash of the master on his back. And Jesus was hung from a tree as entertainment for the crowds that gathered to ridicule him as he gasped his last breaths. Jesus is black, and the pale and hollow imitation of the white supremacists cannot save them. The Jesus who is reaching out to them is a black man, and in order for them to dare to take the hand of a black man, they have to let go of their white supremacist ideology. That has to sink to the depths of the sea, never to be seen again, so that they can reach out and grab the hand of the Savior, who is real flesh and blood. And that Jesus can get into their boat and calm the waters of hatred and fear and ignorance, and help them sail safely to the other side. Here's where it gets tricky. It is easy to look at our white brothers and sisters who live south of the Mason-Dixon line. It is easy to look and to wag our fingers at our backwards brothers and sisters, whose monuments to white supremacy are clearly visible and celebrated, statues of Confederate generals throughout the South. It gets tricky, sisters and brothers who share my pigmentation, because the monuments to white supremacy in the North are very real, but we choose not to look at them. The monuments of white supremacy in this city, pillars of this community generations ago, who believed that Flint was at its best when Flint was segregated. Neighborhoods and schools and shop floors, the legacy of which continues in many of our broken and battered and empty neighborhoods. The monuments of white supremacy course through the blood and the bones of our children, poisoned by lead. The result of systemic and environmental racism that never would have happened if the people in charge really cared about the people who live here in my city. The monuments to white supremacy are even found throughout our state, as this state in the last election put into office a man who can best be called the enabler-in-chief that inspires those who march with torches in Charlottesville, Virginia this weekend. Those of us of my pigmentation who cannot stand white supremacy and wish to distance myself from it cannot but yet understand that it is infecting and it courses through me as well, as much as I want to rid myself of it. We bear that legacy. And Jesus, who is walking on the turbulent waters of this town, Jesus is reaching out to us. And I wonder for how many of us in this city we worship a Jesus who is a figment of our imagination, who is a ghost, who is a specter, who is but a wisp of smoke, who is as pale and as hollow as our own Christianity. Does that describe your Jesus? Or is your Jesus flesh and blood and bone and black?